Welcome to the Lead Every Day show. Our mission is to see a world well led. And our strategy to get there? To empower leaders like you to lead every day. So let's get to work.
I'm always fired up, but I'm especially pumped today. It is episode number 50, and it's a Friday. You can't beat, it's what good combo
That's
there.
great.
Welcome to the Lead Every Day show. I'm Randy Gravitt.
And I'm Mark Miller.
And we got 50 of them, buddy.
50?
That's awesome. Pretty cool.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's good. So maybe we need to think about what do we want to do different for the next 50, because we are reinventing continuously. That's our fundamental we've been talking about. We started yesterday. Today, we're gonna talk about how we do that. And I love this. We'll call it a best practice here. If a person's listening and they really like, how do we, that stuff yesterday you gave us was, self systems and structure. If you missed that, go back and check it out. But today, let's get into some of the meat of this. It's like there really is this opportunity we have to think different, and it's a huge opportunity for us as we think about these fundamentals.
It's the cornerstone of reinventing is you
how you think.
You've got to think differently to do something differently, right? Because our default will be to the same, to the known.
Yeah.
We actually talk about this idea of reinvent continuously is the ability to routinely escape the bounds of the current and known in the pursuit of better skills, methods, and outcomes. Yeah. And so thinking is the cornerstone.
I love that. I know for me, myself, as I'll just speak to myself, it's so easy to get bogged down in the busyness of the business. It's like, it doesn't stop. It's just ongoing. And so if you're going to think different, one of the things we say is you've got to invest the time in that.
Yep.
And I find too few leaders who have think time on their calendar. It is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, and I want to flash forward and give you an action item. We're going to give you some more here in this episode. But in the next 10 days, can you put 2 hours on your calendar and call it think time? And then when somebody calls and wants that time, you can say, I'm sorry, I've already got an appointment.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a meeting with me. You don't have to tell them
them about that.
You don't have to tell them that.
Exactly.
But yeah, you need some think time, and we'll talk more about that. But to me, that's a great action item. The kind of thinking we're talking about, you're probably not going to be able to pull it off in your morning commute for those that still do that.
That's right.
Or standing in the shower.
Yeah.
It's great when you can have those epiphanies and those breakthroughs, but they're not usually your most challenging and difficult issue.
This is not in the deer stand or on the lake
this
or wherever.
This is when you have focused, dedicated time. If you want to think differently, you're gonna have to invest.
Now, people
time.
may be thinking, "What do I think about?" What do I think about? I heard this. This is pretty cool too. I heard a leader a few months back, a big time leader, said, "If you're going to think, if you're going to go have your first thinking meeting, maybe you need to think about your thinking." I thought that was really good. Maybe that's the first thing you need to do, think about your thinking. But if you've got things or time set aside, you might want to make you a list of the things that you need to think about, and not just 2 hours this week. What would happen if you put 2 hours on your calendar every week and you started working through your list of all the things you need to think about? If you're going to reinvent continuously, I think this thinking different idea, investing time, it's not just a little bit of time here. We would encourage you to invest time all the time.
We probably need to do an episode, and I'm sure we'll do an episode or more on this. But if you want to know more, go take a look at Smart Leadership, some work we did several years ago on leadership effectiveness. And one of our huge findings was this concept of margin. Not margin as a vacation or margin as a nap, but margin as a leadership discipline. When you have time set aside to reflect, to assess, to think, to create, and to plan. Like, do you have that on your calendar? There's a chapter in that book called Stop and Think. So I'd love to say more about that. Yeah. I'll just say personally, for the last 40 years, in the first half of my career, I was trying to schedule 1 day a month. I called it a focus day.
Yeah.
And then later in my career, I realized that often that time was being compromised. And somebody would say, well, can you add a breakfast meeting or can you have a quick call? And I looked up, and a lot of those months, I might get a half a day. And then some months, I wouldn't get any.
Yeah.
So in the last half of my career, I went to scheduling 2 days a month, knowing that some might be compromised along the way, and I would still maintain the integrity of having some time set aside.
Yeah, and I would say to the person who's listening here, and I'm going to overstate this, but that time is really almost sacred. I mean, it's not sacred, but it's like you need to protect that time maybe more than any other time on your calendar. But the quicksand is real. Back to your point, it's so easy for us to feel like, well, I can give a little bit of my think time here because that's just me.
But let's go back to what you do in that time. If you reflect, assess, think, create, and plan, and you don't have time to do that, who's doing it?
Right.
Who's doing it? A 12-year study by Harvard, they looked at the calendars of CEOs and found that in a typical week, they're spending 28% of their time alone, working week alone. And somebody said, well, what do you think they're doing? I said, well, I've never been a CEO, but I know a bunch of CEOs, and I tell you what I think they're doing. They're reflecting, they're assessing, they're thinking, they're creating, and they're planning. Now, I don't know if that's your right number or not, but the bigger your challenges, the bigger your goals, the bigger your obstacles, the bigger your opportunities, the more time you're going to need to think.
That's so good. And you even said a while back, and I've shared this with some leaders since, is the higher up you go in an organization, maybe the more time you need to spend alone. Well, this is what goes into that time.
Yeah.
And again, we probably could do an episode on that as well, but it's
or a week,
or at least exactly. It's incredible.
I mean, because it's. I started to say it's a lost art. Well, I'm not sure a lot of leaders ever had it to lose it.
Yeah.
But we found in our research this discipline among great leaders for thousands of years.
Yeah. That's so good.
They carve out time.
That's exactly good. Okay, so there's a couple other things you talk about in the book, and I want to talk about them here before we go today. Just give a nod to them and encourage you, if you're listening, to think, okay, what do I think about? Go back to that. I think one of the things that you said here that was really great was consider the opposite. Consider the opposite. So I want you to talk about that. But then the other thing is you've said for years, and you've modeled this for years, is to lead with questions. Talk about those two things. If somebody's listening, and what do I think about? Talk about the power of thinking about the opposite, and then also the power of questions. You're so good at this.
Well,
enlighten us here.
Well, thanks. I mean, I'm watching the clock here. Let me just say, to consider the opposite is a technique. That if you're trying to free yourself, again, I said the definition has to do with routinely escaping the bounds of the present and what is known. Well, what you're doing is fundamentally different than the opposite. And so I've done this with a group before. They wanted to increase participation at this event over what they had done historically. And I said, well, what would you do to depress attendance? Well, they thought I'd lost my mind, but we brainstormed a bunch of stuff. And then they said, we do a bunch of that. So all of a sudden we had a gateway.
Unlock.
We had a gateway into improvement by removing the impediments because they had unintentionally been doing things that were depressing attendance.
Writers aren't the only one that have writer's block. It's like leadership block too, and this opposite thing can be.
It's just a technique. And then questions, I hesitate to say it's just a technique, but it is.
Yeah.
It's actually a strategy. I think it can become a lifestyle, and you'll get smarter. The people around you will get smarter. You'll demonstrate humility. You'll demonstrate lifelong learning. I just think, again, we probably need to do an episode or 2 or 3 on questions.
Yeah.
Because the best leaders ask the best questions. And I would say they asked more questions.
Yeah, that's really great. And I said you've modeled this. One of the things I know you've done, and I know a lot of leaders that do this, is you have a set of questions for a different scenario. If you're going to go meet with somebody, you have a set of questions. You go prepared for that. Or if you have a meeting coming up, what are the questions you need to ask before the meeting, after the meeting? All this a lot of questions you could come up with. One of the things, maybe if you want to ask better questions, you might need to think through
different categories.
Goes back to your thinking, like what are the categories?
Great interview questions are different than great strategic planning questions.
I'm betting there's very few leaders that have ever thought about what are the questions I need to be asking. And this, again, we could do some episodes on this. We will.
I don't want to leave people hanging. Let's give you a specific example. If you're doing strategic planning, then you go, one of the questions is, what do you want to be true in a decade that's not true today? Yeah. That's a strategic planning question.
That's right.
That's not necessarily the best interview question, although you might gain some insights into that person, right? But you have different questions. You've got different questions as a communicator. One that I'll ask, particularly if I'm going to be trying to communicate something that's complex, is how would I explain this to a 5-year-old?
Yeah. So
and I've
good.
actually gone as far as to go find a 5-year-old
Yeah.
and try to explain it to them and see if they
And
understand
if
it.
they don't understand,
They don't understand it. I got to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah, that's good.
And so just questions are so powerful, but they're not universally applicable.
Yeah.
Different questions work in different contexts and situations.
Yeah, as you begin to tie this stuff together, we've talked about the last couple of days. Mark, yesterday, self, systems, and structure. What's one thing that you could change about yourself in the next year? You want to see different a year from today that's not true today. Secondly, with a system, is there a system that you could put in place to unlock performance? And think about your structure. If you could add one person to your team or one layer to your structure, what would that be? How do you think, if you've not spent much time thinking about it, you don't want to just wing it here. You really want to be thoughtful and strategic when you are reinventing continuously. It starts with the way you think. I hope today has given you some ideas. More importantly, I hope you'll take some time and put it on your calendar and go think. It really is the key to reinventing continuously. It starts with your thinking. I hope you'll join us next week as we continue this fundamental of reinventing continuously. Remember, the best leaders lead every day.